What are the trends that you're seeing?
That's right. Women are leaning in, and companies need to lean in now, too. So women have been getting college degrees at higher rates than men for years. Women are asking for more. They're asking for promotions. They're asking for raises as often as men, and they're not leaving the workplace. So companies need to do more. And the biggest thing is they need to treat diversity like the business priority it is. So what do you do when you want to hit a business goal? You have a compelling case, you set goals, you track progress, you report on your progress, and you hold leaders accountable. And too few companies are doing all of those things.
So, Lareina, you've been working on this report since 2012. Mm-hmm. You know, what is different about this year? Is the difference that there is no difference?
So, we see that companies are stalled. That is in and of itself is finding. But what we find is that we're getting closer to understanding some of the root causes. So what companies are saying is we understand that we have a mega problem here, but help us start to break down problems that we can solve in units of 1 or 2 years. This will take 5, 10 years to actually shift a whole generation. So an example of that is tell us about the onlys. Tell us about microaggression, and also tell us whether targets work and how other companies do it, just as a couple of examples.
So you're singling out this idea of the only this year, which is about, you know, the only woman in the room and the experiences that that woman has as a result of being the only woman in the room. You know, talk to us about why it's so important to understand that experience.
Women who are onlys are having a markedly different experience than women who work with other women. They're more likely to face those everyday slights that we've all experienced, since this is a table of women where you're mistaken for someone more junior, you're spoken over in a meeting, you have to prove your capabilities over and over again, and that wears women who are onlys down. We know they feel under pressure, we know they feel isolated and on guard, and it's hard to imagine women can be their best selves and do their best work if they feel that way in the workplace.
So Square, for example, when it comes to hiring women engineers, one of the things that they do is they put women on a team with other women, which means they have a lot of teams that are only men because, you know, men still dominate the workforce. But the idea is that by being on a team with other women, they'll have that sort of camaraderie and that networking, and that their experience will be better. But it comes at a cost. Is that something that you would recommend?
I actually think it's a really good strategy. In a world where you don't have enough women, how do you make and retain and advance the ones you have? And putting them together creates a different culture for that sub-team. And it starts to tip it. They have role models, they have their own peer network, and they start to advance. Ultimately, what we know about onlys is that if you're the only one over a long period of time, as Rachel was saying, as you're pointing out, you start to feel less motivated to stay at that company, less satisfied, more interested in leaving. If you leave, that's less helpful.
But there's a compromise, right, Rachel? I mean, you are having teams of all men making decisions about other things without women on those teams.
Yeah, let's be clear. I don't think this is a simple choice, but this one and done approach of just I've got a single woman on a team or 2 women on a team, so now I have diversity, has to change. So until we get where we really need to go, which is we have more women at every level, so we're not picking and choosing where to put our underrepresented women across our teams, a good strategy is to group women together and put them into cohorts and accept or realize that that leads to better diversity of ideas on that team and hopefully better performance at that team. So then you can point out and say, look at our blended teams with a good percentage of women and look at the performance they're getting.
And building on that, I mean, the challenge is for companies, it's not a one-shot deal. You can fix onlys, but if that's the only thing you do, you probably won't have a lot of success. And so the really hard thing for management teams is you need to do 5, 6, 7 things in concert, and you need to stick with it. If this is a seasonal initiative, I guarantee you won't be any better than where you were last season.
What's the experience for women of color that you're finding?
So the experience for women of color, we saw this last year as well, it's worse. They face more barriers to advancement, they get less support from managers, they get less access to senior leaders, and of course senior leaders are the people that open doors and get you noticed, and they are promoted more slowly.
So how do we make sure this isn't just solving for a white woman's problem, right? Because all the talk is about gender, not as much about race.
So our report focuses heavily on women of color, and this year we're looking at lesbian women as well because they are having a worse experience in the workplace, and we couldn't agree with you more. Elevating women and advancing women means all women. And actually the women who need the most support in the workplace based on all the research that we've done is Black women and making sure their voices are heard.
Now, Lareina, you are not only the Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer at McKinsey, you also are the leader of tech, hardware, and services. So this is a notoriously male-dominated industry, which we cover every day. That must be an interesting juxtaposition for you?
Sure. So, I mean, it's a couple of different hits. One, for anyone in technical fields, for women in technical fields like engineering, it's harder. Being a person of color is harder. And also, it's probably worth noting, for men of color, it's not an easy road as well, or for anyone who's gay. But one of the things that's interesting is, in the tech field, if I were to put a slight silver lining on it, there is an ethos of transparency, even radical transparency. And you also have people who grow up in an engineering environment where they understand data. So I do think, on a level of hope, one of the things the report does, and I think one of the things that's much more common, is to put it all out there. So as an example, there was one company where men felt that gender policies and initiatives were going to hurt them. And they were like 30% off the benchmark of how everyone else felt. And the CEO basically said, let's have a town hall meeting, let's put it all out there and say, here's what you guys said, let's explore that. Now, that's not going to fix the tech culture in one go, but I do think the emphasis on data and transparency is something that we can benefit from.
And Rachel, you were a co-founder of a startup.
I was.
What was your experience?
Like I think all of us, I've walked into too many rooms where I was the only woman in the room. I mean, the story that always stands out for me is pitching VCs, so we all know what that is, with a co-founder who was a man. And after a couple pitches, he took me aside and said, Rachel, you're not pulling your weight. You're not speaking up enough. And so I had the presence of mind to say, wait and watch the next meeting. Come out after the next meeting, and he said, oh my God, they don't look at you, they don't ask you questions. I can't believe you're speaking up as much as you are. And that's why understanding the only experience matters, because women are getting dinged.
So what did you do?
I just kept speaking up as much as I could, but the big shift was he realized his shift was going from Rachel wasn't doing enough to, wow, look at how hard it is for her in that room. And look at like how she's asserting herself and kind of how effective she's being, given she's an only in the room. And I think that really matters.
Lareina, do you think there's a chance that the Me Too movement, and many of these very powerful men who've been exposed and have lost their jobs, has made it seem like there's more progress than there actually is? Or
I don't think
are you pleased with the progress that we've seen as a result of simply the conversation moving forward?
I don't think companies are under an illusion that there's a tremendous amount of progress. I think that what has been great is what you're saying, is that there's greater awareness, so we're having the discussion. But at the end of the day, what the research shows is there's a bit of a gap between the number of companies that have a policy framework in place that's really good, and actually the belief among employees. Only 60% of employees believe that, men and women, that it would actually run well. And so how do you think about going beyond the policy? How do you do the education, the training, and how do you make sure that you support people and answer their questions in a safe way? So we have a long ways to go beyond just getting sexual harassment policies in place.
So what are concrete things that companies can do, that employees can do, and that managers can do?
So switching gears a little bit, I mean, this is about the underrepresentation of women and underrepresentation of people of color and people from all different types of backgrounds. We really need to change the numbers. And the one thing we found this year, and we've seen this the last couple of years, but is really profound this year, is women are less likely to get promoted to manager. They're less likely to be hired in at manager. And so what happens when you look at the manager level in organizations, 2/3 are men and 1/3 are women. So we are tilting the scales right from the get-go, and women can never catch up. So one of the big recommendations this year, in addition to just treating it like the business priority it is focus on that critical step up to manager and start closing those gaps. Because we did an analysis, and if companies don't close those gaps, the hard truth is the numbers will not change.